Every 15 or 20 years, there seems to be a renewed foreign aid debate about why it needs to be reformed or abolished altogether. And one thing that's really kind of interesting whenever these debates emerge is that it's not just the critics who are dissatisfied with foreign aid, it's the advocates of foreign aid who usually say, yeah, we really do need to reform it, but it's very critical, and to make it work, we need to do X, Y, and Z. The reforms have to be like this or like that. And so it seems like ultimately nobody's ever really satisfied with foreign aid, including the advocates. And now, of course, we're talking about this issue because Trump has decided to abolish USAID. I think that that's a good idea. We can talk later about how he's going about doing it, but for that matter, I think it's a good idea. And it's not just the United States that is cutting back on aid. Now, European countries like Germany and the UK and France, just to name a few, are cutting back significantly on foreign aid, partially because they want to increase defense spending, but I think also because it's a popular thing to do. In any event, here we are with another foreign aid discussion. And the fact of the matter is, we have now more than 7 decades during which rich countries have transferred literally trillions of dollars to poor countries. But what we haven't seen during that time period is a corresponding transfer of prosperity. And of course, during that time, we've seen a lot of lending fads, a lot of different rationales for giving aid. Aid to go mainly to support infrastructure or to support agriculture or education or policy reform or to promote democracy or to support women or for microfinance or for debt forgiveness. There's always new rationales to make aid effective or to focus aid on some new specific missions, and sometimes they get recycled over the years. And the justifications for aid are also quite varied. You know, we have to give money to poor countries because they're stuck in a poverty trap. That's one. Another one is aid is good not just for the recipient countries, but for the donor nations because it's good for their economy. A lot of that money gets spent in the United States and supports exports, et cetera, et cetera. Or it's good for donor countries because it helps enormously in its diplomacy and in geopolitics. Um, uh, or we need to give aid to these countries because the international economic system somehow is biased against poor countries and they just need aid to industrialize. There's a lot more what I would consider spurious justifications. Um, but but we now have had enough time, decades and decades, for scholars to look into the record of foreign aid, and it's fair to say that there is a scholarly consensus around foreign aid, that aid does not work to promote development, that aid has real limitations about what it actually can accomplish, and economic development is not one of those things. And yet, when you look at aid spending by rich countries, specifically focused on economic development, what you see over the course of the last more than 60 years is just this continuous increase in overseas development assistance spending. So that in the year 2023, which is the last year for which we have all the international data, overseas development assistance reached a record level of $223 billion. That is rich countries spending aid for development on poor countries. So there's this big gap between the scholarly consensus on aid and the political push for more aid. And yet we have known for a long time that aid has big problems, including the political system has acknowledged it. During the Clinton administration, for example, One task force found that, quote, despite decades of foreign assistance, most of Africa and parts of Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East are economically worse off today than they were 20 years ago. I could name dozens and dozens of studies just from that time period, from the 1990s and early part of this century, that come to that kind of conclusion. The World Bank had issued a thorough review and found that the majority of their projects were failing. The Congress in the 1990s had a commission that found that 50 to 60% of their projects were failing. So this is not something that is unknown to the political system. And yet, more and more money over the course of the decades keeps going to foreign aid. And I think a large part of the reason is just political. This is the way that politics in Washington and in the other capitals of the world work. You have an aid industrial complex where you have interest groups that are very dependent on this spending. Once you create a bureaucracy, it's very hard to get rid of. And those interest groups include, of course, the aid agencies themselves, the consultancies that are multi-million dollar consultancies that depend on the foreign aid disbursements to do their jobs, the bureaucracies, and of course the recipient governments and their bureaucracies. So there's this large um, constituency that is not representative of either the scholarly consensus or what Americans actually believe that are actually forming public policy in Washington. But that is the way that so much of politics, not just foreign aid, works. I'm going to be focusing my comments just on development aid. There's a lot of different kinds of aid. There's military aid, there's diplomatic aid, there's humanitarian aid, there's emergency aid, there's health aid, there's environmental, energy aid, and so on. What I'm going to be talking about is the aid intended to promote economic development, which of course is the major goal of foreign aid. That is where the bulk of aid goes. And so I think that that's um, what most people think about when they think we're helping foreign poor countries to develop. Um, and so um, my contention is that foreign aid is not important for development and that it can actually, and that's the best that you can say about it, and that it can actually be harmful. If you look at the record of foreign aid, you see absolutely no relationship between aid and economic growth. Um, and you do see a relationship between the countries that have received the most aid and poor outcomes. And we can talk about that in a little bit. Um, One frustration that I have living in Washington and talking about uh, development is that in Washington, D.C., when you talk about economic development in poor countries, the conversation quickly devolves into a conversation about foreign aid, which to me is quite a distraction given that its record is so poor and at best it's irrelevant to development. But let me talk about that in a minute. I just think that that kind of discussion is a legacy of foreign aid itself, because you have a subfield of economics called development economics that began at the same time that official foreign aid programs were born in the post-World War II period. And the idea was that for poor countries, standard development, standard economic policies of the kind that made rich countries rich don't really apply to poor people, didn't apply to developing countries, and that what you needed to have for these people was a different set of policies, a different approach to development, and foreign aid was invented to promote those new approaches because, after all, why were these countries poor and other countries rich? It must be because some inherent factors that made poor people different than rich people. Of course, that's a very patronizing way of looking at development. But nevertheless, that is explicitly what happened in this subfield of economics that was called development economics. Um, and a big part of the foreign aid uh, genesis was based around central planning for poor countries. Uh, the huge role that the state has to play in economic development, supported by foreign aid. So foreign aid went into countries that had state-owned enterprises and massive regulation, trade protectionism, infant industry promotion, industrial policy, price controls, wage controls. They had a lot of countries in Africa, for example, had agricultural marketing boards where peasants would, would produce crops, and then they were required to sell those crops to the state, to the marketing board is what they would call it, basically a state agency that would pay the peasants below market prices for their products, and then the state would then resell them at market prices, grab the profit or the difference, and use that money supposedly to promote development. But of course, um, in that case, it actually discouraged agricultural development, which is what happens when you pay people below the price that they can otherwise get. And I could go through every single one of these bad policies and tell you why they were perverse and bad for development. And then, nevertheless, they were supported by foreign aid. And if you look even today, when you look around the world at countries that receive foreign aid, especially the ones that get the most foreign aid, they're the countries that have the worst economic policies on record, which is the cause of poor people's misery in the first place. And it is in that sense that foreign aid actually does help to sustain underdevelopment in practice. So aid in these cases, we're strengthening the state. I mean, I can read you a quote from a Nobel laureate, Gunnar Myrdal, who was one of the leading development economists, who in the 1950s said this. And it sounds to us today kind of like curious, why would anybody really believe this? But he said, it is now commonly agreed that an underdeveloped country should have an overall integrated national plan. All underdeveloped countries are now, under the encouraging and congratulating applause of the advanced countries, attempting to furnish themselves with such a plan. And of course, the applause came in the form of foreign aid for central planning. As I say, today it sounds very odd to us because we know that central planning doesn't work. And so aid no longer explicitly promotes central planning and it promotes other ideas. But that patronizing attitude of foreign aid has not gone away, even if different approaches have since been tried. Um, I should say that that approach, that sort of that patronizing approach to foreign aid, has also justified the support of all sorts of dictatorships and unsavory regimes all around the world under the idea that this is going to be good for the people who live in those countries. But of course, that in practice is simply supported um, regimes that either the United States or the free world should not have been supporting to begin with. But that in itself points to another problem with foreign aid, which is even so-called development assistance is highly politicized. If you look at the way that aid is actually spent by governments, the determinants of who gets the aid um, include how important it is to that country in terms of geopolitics and not necessarily whether this project or that project is a priority for economic development or this country or that country is. So geopolitics plays a very big role. And you see that with European countries lending to their sort of favored recipient countries. The United States does that kind of thing too, and so on. Okay, so by the late 1970s and 80s, it became very clear that when you pour a lot of money into a developing country that has really bad policies, you're not going to get development. You're going to get debt, right? There were a minority of development economists who were among the first generation of development economists who were saying These are really bad ideas. We should not be promoting these ideas. We should not have foreign aid, et cetera, et cetera. But they were ignored up until many, many decades later. Um, but basically what the aid industry was discovering late by the late 70s and early 80s is that just because you build a bridge or a road or a factory in a poor country doesn't mean that that's going to lead to development. More likely, what it's going to lead to is debt, because who's going to pay for the upkeep of the bridge or the road if, in fact, that country was unable to produce that and to build that and finance that bridge or that road by itself? It means that there are other underlying, more important problems that keep it from actually sustaining the type of growth necessary to keep that infrastructure going. And so um, uh, you had a real big buildup of debt, and especially the countries that received a lot of aid as a percentage of either their government revenue or as a percent of GDP. So much of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is on a list of what the World Bank and the IMF call the highly indebted poor countries. And so if you look over the course of many decades, you see just this massive buildup of debt, but not development, in the most aid-dependent countries. Um, like I say, sub-Saharan Africa is a big part of that. And there too, there have been a lot of good scholarly studies that show that the answer to the problem of debt, which was created by government guaranteed development and foreign aid together, is not uh, forgiving debt, which is a big, over the course of the several decades, has also been a big part of foreign aid to those co countries, is that they create new foreign aid programs to lower the debt. But the problem is it doesn't solve the underlying problems. So then these countries start to build up debt again, and they just get on a borrowing treadmill. The World Bank and the IMF had a big push to forgive debt yet again about 20 years ago, and now African countries are back on a troublesome trajectory. None of this, of course, would have occurred or could have or would have been likely if the aid programs and the government approach to development didn't exist. So what happened? The World Bank and other aid agencies began by the early 80s what they called structural adjustment lending or policy-based lending. What does that mean? It means that, okay, if we give aid to countries that have really bad policies, it's not going to work. We can see that it's not working, even if it's just for discrete projects like a road or a bridge or a factory. So what we should do is give aid, but condition it. We'll give you aid only if you change your policies to make them good policies, market-oriented policies, open up your economy, do that kind of thing. If you do that, we'll give you aid. So that's what they started doing at the beginning of the 1980s, the World Bank and several other aid agencies. This is so-called conditional lending. Um, However, it's kind of what the IMF was set up to do in in the 1940s after World War II. Uh, the IMF is not really an aid agency. It's an agency, the International Monetary Fund is an agency that is intended to give money to countries that are going through some sort of instability or crisis or have bad economic policies in exchange for those countries to have good economic policies so that they can get on a good standing to start to grow and so on. So if the IMF has already been doing that in the very same countries that the World Bank was operating in, did it really make sense for the World Bank to start doing that too? In a sense, the World Bank started to look a little bit more like the IMF, and the IMF, because its loans were failing, it's actually started to give out loans that were more concessionary. They were like easy loans, started to look more like the World Bank. Okay, the failure of IMF loans to promote, excuse me, good policies should have been an indicator that the new approach of the World Bank to promote conditional-based lending and good policies was probably not going to work. And in fact, uh, policy-based lending conditioned on market reforms, has also not worked. And the reason is because remember, these are government aid agencies that have to lend. They have a lot of money and they have to keep spending it in order to prove their relevance. So what happens is a sort of charade that everybody knows about. The recipient governments know that these governments are going to lend almost no matter what. So they promise reforms. They get the money. They do very little to reform or nothing at all. And then they say, oh, we're still in trouble. And the World Bank comes back, so does the IMF, and says, well, you really need to do these reforms. If you really promise, we'll give you the money. And then they take the money again. And what you see is very little actual reform going on. So there's no correlation, again, between conditional lending to promote good policies and foreign aid. Foreign aid does not work to promote development uh, because everybody knows that the World Bank, and the IMF have to lend. So it eliminates the credibility of any conditionality that is imposed on loans. I mean, most people and the political system, the citizens of rich countries and so on are not paying attention about on what or how well the aid program to Malawi is performing. Did they really comply with the latest package or not? People aren't paying attention to that. There are cases, and there have been cases where the whole world actually is watching, which was happening in the 1990s with respect to Russia. Russia was actually not complying and it was getting a lot of money from the World Bank and the IMF and the United States, and it became an embarrassment that they couldn't just uh, have this um, ritual dance, as one scholar called it. So what happened was that the aid agencies actually cut off aid to Russia on several occasions. And it was only when they cut off aid that the reforms that Russia started to undertake were undertaken. It was the cutoff of aid, not the aid itself, that actually promoted reforms. And that pattern of cutting off aid to promote reforms is something that we see all around the world in other cases. After all, uh, a couple of the greatest economic development success stories, Taiwan and South Korea, are an example of that. They used to receive massive aid from the United States, but they only started to take off economically when the United States cut them off from U.S. aid. And that concentrated the minds of policymakers. That's actually when good policies, pro-growth policies began, but it didn't require foreign aid. And so the problem with the World Bank and aid agencies is that once countries like Russia start undertaking some of those reforms, these agencies immediately start lending money again, which undermines the push to reform once again, because most governments are not interested in reform and doing the hard work of actually undertaking deep-rooted policy change. And this is the problem. In my view, the World Bank and the IMF and aid agencies are actually slowing economic growth precisely because they're supporting governments that have bad policies, incentives not to reform, uh, sustain uh, poor institutions, all of that stuff. And this policy-based lending that is intended to promote good reform doesn't work for all of those reasons. Um, that doesn't mean that countries haven't reformed. That doesn't mean that some good things haven't happened. A lot of good things happened all over the developing world in terms of market reforms and growth and so on. But what we've seen is that some countries reform, some countries don't, but it has zero to do with the aid relationship. I mean, after all, c countries in Latin America and so on didn't start abandoning statist policies because USAID and the World Bank had been lending to them for decades and decades. It happened because there was a crisis. There was a crisis in central planning, and they tried every other policy, so they started to move toward the market. Anyway, okay, so aid doesn't promote market reforms. What that led some advocates of foreign aid to suggest, what if a country um, actually has good policies and is actually undertaking good reforms? Shouldn't shouldn't aid go into those countries and only those countries? And wouldn't that be a good idea? But there again, there's been good studies by the IMF itself and others that have found that even under those conditions, aid doesn't work. I'm going to just read a quote that I have somewhere by Angus Deaton. He's a Nobel economist who is considered, he's not somebody from the right or anything like that. He's a Princeton economist who is considered sort of a dean of development economics, uh, who who said this, and I think that this is important. Even in good environments, aid comprises institutions, it contaminates local politics, and it undermines democracy. If poverty and underdevelopment um, are primarily consequences of poor institutions, then by weakening those institutions or stunting their development, large aid flows do exactly the opposite of what they're intended to do. It is hardly surprising then that in spite of the direct effects of aid that are often positive, the record of aid shows no evidence of any overall beneficial effect. So this is similar to the concept of you build a bridge and there you see the direct effect of aid, but overall, it doesn't help development and it can actually harm development. The same thing goes with institutions, with the promotion of democracy. I mean, in a lot of these countries, the majority of the government's budget is foreign aid financed. And so that undermines democracy. If you have a government that is more responsive to foreign governments than to your own population, it completely undermines democracy. And that's one of the points that Angus Deaton was making. So when you have especially large flows of aid, you will really undermine development, democracy, and institutions. We published a study at the Cato Institute many years ago by Simeon Jankoff, who was a top economist at the World Bank, who decided to compare. Um, this was what he called the curse of foreign aid. He decided to compare the effect of large aid flows on countries with the effect of um, natural resource wealth, because a lot of poor countries are very rich in natural resources, but they end up being poor. It's called the curse of natural resources. And the reason they are is because they have bad policies and all of it, that money goes to governments, it creates corruption, it doesn't lead to good policies. And what he was suggesting is foreign aid performs in the same way, but he measured it and he found out that the curse of aid is worse than the curse of natural resources. And so that was quite striking. I'm going to end with a quote from the a pioneer in development economics who I think was one of these lone voices at the time when everybody was saying we need to centralize power in the state for developing countries to develop. And he was saying, no, that's a bad idea. But I think he summarized pretty well the idea of aid and the idea of development. I'm just going to quote quote him to finish off. And we're talking about Peter Bauer. And he said, if all conditions for development other than capital are present, capital will soon be generated locally or will be available from abroad. If, however, the conditions for development are not present, then aid will be necessarily unproductive and therefore ineffective. Thus, if the mainsprings of development are present, material progress will occur even without foreign aid. If they are absent, it will not occur even with aid. And that, I think, is a very good summary of the fundamental flaw in the foreign aid approach, which is a top-down approach to development, when in fact, development occurs as a bottom-up process of people discovering within the right institutional environment uh, the best ways to create wealth and to cooperate with each other and with other countries and so on. And then the question becomes, what are those policies and institutions That's a whole lot other discussion. But to sum it up, those policies and institutions have a lot to do with economic freedom, the idea that people should have private property rights, contracts should be respected, that there should be a strong rule of law, that government should be limited, and that government spending and taxation should be also limited, as should be regulations, and trade should be open. And at the Cato Institute, with our friends at the Fraser Institute in Canada, we do a report on economic freedom in the world. It's an index on economic freedom where we measure 42 different indicators around the world of economic freedom. And one thing that we find in this empirical study is that the countries that are most free are also the countries that are most prosperous. That really doesn't surprise us, but this is a systematic study of 165 countries over the course of many, many decades. And the findings are strong. The freest countries in the top quartile are having a per capita income of about $52,000, and the least free have a per capita income of $6,900 around there. So economic freedom is really the key. And that, like I say, involves institutions like the rule of law and so on. So we have a really good idea going all the way back since the time of Adam Smith in the 1700s of what the right recipe or policies and institutions are, no matter who you are. Hyperinflation is bad if you're a Bolivian or if you're a German. What we don't have one recipe for is for each country how to get from point A to point B. And that's not something that you can just answer with one answer. Each country has a different situation. Maybe it's a dictatorship, maybe it's a democracy, maybe it's has different ethnicities. You have to take into account the history, the culture, the politics at the time to know what sequencing of reforms and what reforms would work best. And you never really know that the application of the right reforms is more of an art than a science, even though we know what the right reforms are. So while we have one answer about what the recipe is, we don't have one answer for every country about how to get from point A to point B. And to me, that's another reason why it's very important to get rid of foreign aid agencies, because they have a tendency to have a monopoly answer for everybody. And that influences the development approach for countries that are very diverse and diverse situations all around the world. And I think that in a world without the World Bank or aid agencies, we would see a lot more experimentation about what works and what doesn't, and countries would be more free to try new things. So that's it for now, but I'm happy to take questions.
I'm going to try to offer this as sort of like a thought experiment that I would ask you to address. And of course, it's a little bit provocative, but I'm going to try to keep it as neutral as possible. And that is, we have a situation here now in this area, in an area called Gaza. Okay, and the famous question here is, what will be the day after? So let's make an assumption here. I mean, I think anybody would be hard pressed to find anybody in this country who would not like to see these people have good lives. So let's say tomorrow the hostilities stop, and let's say tomorrow they just say, okay, we're done with all this other stuff. We just want to live. We just want to have a better life. So we've got about 2 million folks living down there in this area, an area which President of the United States has said could be a beautiful Riviera, you know. There has been no shortage over the years of aid money flowing into this place. Now, you may say that wasn't development aid. I don't know what the motivation of most of it was, but a lot of money has flowed in this place, and it is very poor. So let me offer as a thought experiment to you, tomorrow, gunfire stops, 2 million people, Gaza, everybody wants them to have a better life. There's no question that there's all going to be all kinds of people stepping forth to do what you just talked about. How do we give them money to make them better off? In your opinion, what do we what do we do? What can be done to so that these people can start tomorrow and start having a better life?
Well, I mean, I know what the I think are the right policies and institutions that should be implemented there, and I don't have much of a doubt what they are. The more challenging part is how to do it, dealing with the right constituencies so that it actually takes root, so that it's actually accepted. And I have no doubt that in practice, most people around the world actually um, like like to have greater choice and more freedom to do things, which is not the case and hasn't been the case in Gaza for decades because of their leadership over there and the regime that they've been subjected to. But what does it mean? It means that they should be open to free trade, that they should have a system of property rights that is well protected, that they have a justice system that works. That's way easier said than done. I mean, it took 8 centuries for the rule of law to develop in Europe, so it's not really realistic to think that that can just happen overnight in any country that doesn't have that tradition, which is one of the reasons that I always think that for developing countries, it's not a bad idea to outsource um, the ju aspects of the court system or the justice system to countries that do have that tradition. You don't really see that much, but I think that that's something that should actually be considered in Gaza. But again, all institutions need to have some sort of support for them to actually take root and be 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 sustained and established more. I think that it is true that institutions make a big difference, but so does culture. And culture is sort of the mother of institutions, which isn't to say that institutions don't shape culture because they do too. It's a complex relationship, but a lot of the work has to be ideological if you want to put it in those terms. And I don't use it as a bad word. I think that, a set of principles and ideas that support the respective human dignity, that expand the range of personal choice of people so that they can create wealth on their own and that people start to see that through their own efforts they can improve their own lives. Most of the time when that happens in developing countries that have been repressed for a long time, such as the case of Gaza, which is a uh, underdeveloped region, uh, people welcome that. And so, in a sense, um, you have to let people experience the benefits of greater freedom. And economic freedom is a key to not just wealth generation, but also the sustenance of other freedoms, like freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and even uh, greater political autonomy. Uh, so, um, so I think that that point is oftentimes lost on advocates of freedom of the press or human rights or specific freedoms that are important. Many of those advocates are also hostile to the idea of economic freedom or the market. And yet, we see from the work that we do at the Cato Institute through a lot of empirical evidence that economic freedom is very important for sustaining other freedoms. And the more people have experience with that, the more likely that those types of policies take root. So I don't think I have a better answer than that because I don't know enough about Gaza or the political situation there to tell you. And this is the way that it would best work out to implement these reforms. But I think I've told you what I can.
Do, do, do you have doubts? And again, I'm loading the question here, but that again, tomorrow is the day after, and it's all starting from scratch. That the first thing that's going to happen is all kinds of initiatives to give aid to pour money in there to develop it. Was it, is there at least a 50% probability that that is going to happen?
Oh, I have no doubt that's going to happen. There's just no, I don't see how that would not happen, that there wouldn't be an aid push.
Okay, so please say who you are and then ask your question.
Okay. Hi, Ian, can you see me?
Yeah, hi, how are you?
Hi, thank you for the fascinating talk. So two questions, if I
Oh,
may.
who are you?
I'm Liad. I'm a PhD student
In what?
in
Hmm.
biology of everything.
Okay.
So excuse me for the basic questions, not from economics.
No.
So when it comes to development, there are still hundreds of millions of people living in extreme poverty. And sitting here in a nice hotel after a nice dinner, it's a bit hard to say we'll just have to wait 8 decades for them to come out of poverty. So I am asking if we do want to do something to help expedite or faster make things faster, what interventions that we see can actually make life easier or make the development process more easy for these kind of countries. And in specific, do you see these kind of interventions coming from government aid or more from philanthropic donations? And do you see any difference? And on another topic, you didn't touch health aid. And do you see any major benefits coming from there when you see, again, major crises like AIDS, polio, or malaria? Did you want to do something about it? Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Great questions. Um, yeah, I mean, today we have hundreds of millions of people around the world that are living in extreme poverty. Um, I think the latest figure is something like 800 million. And you can point to that and say this is terrible, which it is. But instead of just taking a snapshot of what's going on right now, it's better to look at the whole movie. Just a few decades ago, it was 40 some percent of the world's population. We have never lived in a better time uh, in, uh, for poor people in the world. If you just look at all of the data, you see not only that poverty has dropped to below 10% within a short period of time, which is the first time in history that we've achieved such fast and broad success. If you look at every important indicator of human well-being, whether it's access to safe drinking water or literacy or infant mortality rates or whatever, virtually everywhere in the world, and especially in developing countries, those have improved and improved markedly to the point that you can say that in terms of standard of living, the poor are catching up to the rich. Every graph of indicators of human development show how the poor are catching up in all those types of indicators. And why is that happening? It's happening precisely because of the move to the market, to move to globalization that the world has been going through for the past several decades. And so the answer, it has not been happening because of foreign aid or um, direct interventions. It has been happening because of an increase in freedoms. And in this case, particularly increase in economic freedoms, freer trade, freer markets. And that's the answer. If you're looking for a particular intervention that can really help poor people, there is this tendency to want to help, and I understand that, but we now know that there are real limits on what rich countries can do to actually promote self-sustaining growth in poor countries. One of the things that it can do is to open up its own markets to the exports of those countries. Another thing that it can do, and I always advocate, is cut off foreign aid, because that is, especially in the countries that have the most poverty, it's because they have the worst policies, and foreign aid sustains those. So cut off foreign aid. But beyond that, you don't really have much control over what Malawi ends up doing. You can try to persuade it. But I do think though that countries around the world have benefited enormously just because of the changes that have been going on, and a lot of countries have improved their own policies. At the end of the day, What matters for a country's development is its own domestic policies and institutions, and not outside factors like the weather or foreign aid or geography or whether France likes this country or not. Those things don't matter, including on free trade issues. If the United States opened up its markets to a lot of African countries completely, and that only helped a little bit because those countries could not get their act together to reform enough in order to export up to up to the quota that the United States gave them. They didn't even fulfill their export quotas. So there's a limited amount of things that rich country governments can do other than open their markets and foreign aid and serve as an example of what creates prosperity. That's different than the types of other aids that you mentioned, which you could call um, poverty alleviation or charitable type aid or health aid. Obviously, when that kind of aid is dispersed, people benefit directly from it and it improves their lives. But that should not be confused with aid that promotes development. That kind of aid doesn't promote development. It's more charitable. And I think that non-governmental organizations are better at providing charitable aid than our government organizations. There is a role for the U.S. government and rich country governments to do health aid, I think, especially when it comes to disease and pandemic type monitoring and control. That I think is fine because that's a public good, but that's also limited. And there was about 15 years ago, and even before, there was a very strong argument being made that rich countries should promote aid for health in poor countries, not just as a charitable thing, but because it also helps promote development. If people are sick all the time, they can't go to work, and so on and so forth. But, if the countries have bad overall policies, healthy people are not going to be producing wealth. So we see that the United States has done a lot of good, actually saving lives with AIDS programs and so on. But that has not translated into greater growth. And now we have studies about it. There was a good article that The Economist just, I think, this past week wrote, a long article, overview of foreign aid that actually came to the same conclusions that I've been talking to you about, that it hasn't worked. And it also included the insights about health spending, which maybe it's good for the people who are receiving it, but it does not promote development. So those are trickier areas, but let's not expect that those things promote development.
My name is Shirley.
Hi. Hi.
I studied
Hi
economics
there.
and sustainability. Um, yeah, and it seems like you're saying that foreign aid in the current state that it's operating at the moment is not helpful, but it seems that you're saying that if you change the method, it could be helpful. Like, if, if the policies are not that great and you can change them and you can invest in countries with better policies in areas that actually I don't know, the governments think that is going to be helpful, and you I don't know, like pick the right areas. I think that could be still helpful. Like the way that it's working now, like what now it might not be very helpful, but it doesn't mean that foreign aid in general is not helpful. It means that the way that it's operating now, it's not helpful. Matt, I understand and hearing from you.
No, that's not at all what I think. I think that aid is not going to be helpful. That government officials don't know more than anybody else in terms of what industry or what company or what sector should be you should invest in. And you don't want to give the government the ability to pick winners and losers. Well, there's a lot of history on industrial policy all around the world, and it's almost entirely a failure. And when you do that in countries that are not advanced economies, I think it's bad for advanced economies. But when you do it in poor countries that don't have institutions like the rule of law and safeguards against corruption and all of that stuff, it's a recipe for disaster. It will automatically be protecting your friends, giving money to to the guy who's doing this business, and an enrichment scheme. But even if it didn't devolve into that, there's no reason to believe that government officials are somehow wiser and have the ability to see what company is going to succeed. I trust much more people using their own money and making that bet, that risky bet, than people using everybody else's money. And if it succeeds, the private sector under that scheme uh, somehow benefits. But if it doesn't, then it socializes the losses, which is the more common experience, and that's not fair. That falls most heavily on poor people. So I am completely against somehow improving foreign aid to do what you're saying. I think that, and it's not novel either. That has been tried. That's what that we had decades of experience where that has failed. So I don't think that there is a role for foreign aid. I think it's almost guaranteed to do more harm than good.
So I'm Leo, and I teach and study mathematics. I would like to ask you two questions. The first is whether donor countries or international institute ever tried possibly counterintuitive approach, which is instead of paying for reform to be done, to reward a reform that has been done. So the intuitive thing is to give the money to the one who is the most suffering at the moment, but a more efficient way perhaps could be to reward the money for somebody who indeed succeeded in implementing a reform that is rooted. So this is the first one. And the second is, what do you think about the effect of immigration? So immigration can relieve a country which cannot sustain its population and has hunger and wars, etc. And on the other hand, I think the strongest population is the first to leave the country, so it can have an adverse effect.
Great questions. Um, the first question, which is sort of trying to think outside the box instead of giving foreign aid to encourage countries to do the right thing, just give them money once they do the right thing as a sort of reward, and then you can guarantee that they're doing the right thing. So in a way, yes, that has been tried. It was kind of what I mentioned about what about if we just give money to governments that are doing the right things and so on. And there again, the studies don't look good. The IMF had a study that looked at that and said that that doesn't work either. And one of the reasons is because, to get from point A to point B, B being the best policy environment that you want, there's a lot of reforms that you have to do. So suppose that this country did a couple reforms and then you gave them aid. They didn't want to do the reforms to begin with, but they didn't have a choice, and so they gave them aid. You're slowing down the next set of reforms, almost assuredly. Also, the reforms are the rewards themselves. When you open up trade, you start to get more investment, and that's what you want to see. You don't want to have artificial investment because that in itself has negative consequences. It can have a negative consequence on the exchange rate. It can have a negative consequence on further policy reform, and if it's government to government aid, then it strengthens the government, and then that if that government wants to invest in the private sector, it'll start to invest in things that may not be productive. So I don't think that that's such a good idea. It would be novel, but I don't think it's such a good idea. The United States has an aid program called the Millennial Challenge Corporation, which kind of does that, but it hasn't been any more successful than USAID. And then your second question was about immigration. I'm in favor of immigration. I think that that's one of the best development policies that you can have. You could raise the per capita income of the world significantly if you let a lot more people into developed countries. Because the moment that, say, a Mexican or a Central American comes into the United States, even if they're low skilled, like an agricultural worker or a construction worker, his salary increases by 5 or 10 times. They're doing the exact same work, but the productivity is so much higher in a developed country precisely because it has the right sets of policies and institutions that um, that have made that country rich. And when you make a country rich where you have huge productivity gains in most of the economy, even the sectors of the economy, like the guy that gives a haircut, the productivity of the barber is pretty much the same today as it was 50 years ago, right? But his salary has increased a lot. Why? Because people need haircuts. And if you're going to be paying the guy the same salary from 50 years ago, he's going to get another job. He's not going to be a barber. So everybody benefits. And that's the benefit of freedom. Okay, so if you allowed more migration, you would raise the per capita income of the world quite a bit. And it would be beneficial for the United States. It would be beneficial for the developing country. There is now evidence. What you also referred to in the second part of that part of your question was that outward migration of the best people could be bad for the country that they're leaving. That concept is called the brain drain. Um, but in fact, there is now, in the last, I would say, 10 or 15 years, a lot more research into that, which finds that there's a positive effect. It's called a brain gain in the sense that first of all, these people go to rich countries and then they send a lot of money back through private channels, and that money tends to be much more effective at alleviating poverty and even creating some wealth and educating their families and so on. That's much more effective than what foreign aid agencies can do. But secondly, suppose you're Nigerian and you decide to become a doctor and move to the United States to become a doctor. You can make a lot of money, or a nurse. Um, and you're one of, you're very smart Nigerian, and you're able to accomplish that. You're not just sending money back. The possibility, just the possibility of being able to move creates aspirations in a lot of people in Nigeria who then study to become nurses and to become um, professionals that are better paid, who never end up leaving. They plan on leaving, but then for whatever reasons in life, they end up staying there. And so that's a positive effect that wouldn't have happened without the possibility of greater migration. And so economists have been studying that has been a positive effect of migration.
Nice to meet you. My name is Gabriel Joe. I recently came from London working in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And so we work quite a lot with foreign aid. And I'm quite curious to collect them. Sorry. So I'm quite curious to understand, in your opinion, what would be considered a successful providing of aid. For example, Poland would be considered a country that the EBRD sees as a successful country that received a lot of financial aid and infrastructure. And following up regarding China, so China received a huge amount of aid and it managed to alleviate itself from poverty. Now, I'm pretty sure that you won't think that it's the aid that was successful. So in your opinion, what made Poland successful? What made China successful if it was not the aid?
The economic reforms, there's no question. In the case of Poland, Poland was the first country that, after the, uh, the fall of the Berlin Wall, implemented sort of big bang approach, widespread market reforms under the Prime Minister Leszek Balcerowicz. And remember, when communism collapsed, nobody in the world had ever experienced moving a country from communism back to the free market. There was no experience to draw from. There was plenty of experience of countries that went from the market to tyranny and to statism and to communism, but nothing in the other direction. And Poland was a pioneer in that in Eastern and Central Europe, under Leszek Balcerowicz, who had understood the importance of policy reform and institutions. And so what he did was he eliminated price controls, he deregulated the economy, he did a lot of things really fast, and they were successful almost overnight because before there you would go to the stores and there was no food. You would go to the shops and there was nothing. And within a matter of days, Poland changed. Once they gave people freedom, markets were full. The prices were initially high, but then with competition, they just started to go down. But anyway, it's better to have a lot of abundance at higher prices than low prices and you can't find anything. And because Poland showed that it was successful, other countries in the region started going down that path. But it wasn't foreign aid, and it wasn't USAID that was telling them what to do or not. So I guess I would want to look exactly at how the aid was spent. No doubt that some aid was probably spent well. My claim about foreign aid is not that every time that you spend money on foreign aid, it is bad. It's hard to have spent over the course of many decades trillions of dollars and not accomplish something good. My claim is that in general it just doesn't work that way. And the reason that Poland was finally succeeded was because of policy change. Poland was also receiving a lot of money, foreign aid money before the big changes. So it wasn't because of the aid, it was because of policy change. And the same thing with respect to China, especially if you look at aid as a per capita aid in China, then those amounts are really minuscule. And we know why reforms happened in China, and they had absolutely nothing to do with foreign aid.
I'm a rude guy named Oren. I forgot to mention. I
Okay.
study security studies, a master's. I want to ask, don't you think that by not providing aid as the US, you let the Chinese provide aid through the Road and Belt Initiative, and you basically lose the field of soft power around the world?
No, I know that argument. I'm not so concerned with it because I think that the Belt and Road Initiative is really bad policy. It's really bad for China. It's a massive foreign aid project. They too think that by doing this, they're going to gain all sorts of friends and so on. But I mean, it's already been many years since they've been doing it, and some of their biggest recipients uh, in Asia have turned against them because the population doesn't like the massive Chinese influence in their countries. And that has also happened in a lot of African countries. You also have debt that is being developed in these countries, which is part of the reason why these resentments are coming up. And I just don't have, excuse me, that much confidence in the Chinese leadership that they're making good investment decisions. And many of them are bad investment decisions, and there's no real way for them to collect money to collect from those debts. They spent probably about $40 billion in Venezuela during the Hugo Chavez regime, which was a socialist disaster. Um, and they got some of their money back, but um, it was a waste of money for the Chinese, frankly. I think they're doing a lot of that. And when I hear about how the Chinese are doing all sorts of things that the United States should copy, it makes me think of Japan during the 1980s when everybody was saying Japan is so much smarter at managing its economy. The United States should copy Japan. And then all of a sudden, Japan's economic system collapsed and it was a big shambles. I think that China has huge economic problems and that sooner or later they're going to manifest themselves in a crisis. And so I would not copy that. Um, and I'm not as concerned about losing whatever political influence some of that money can buy you in many countries around the world, simply because I think that you almost always hear, especially in Washington, about how critical to U.S. security almost any country in the world is, and usually it's not that it's not as critical as people make it out to be. And if it were, the United States has the wherewithal to respond to a security threat if in fact it occurred. I'm not that confident that foreign aid is very good for diplomacy to begin with.
Hi, my name is Corinne. I'm the COO of Echo 3D. We're a platform for 3D digital asset management. I'm wondering, you mentioned, there's a lot of voices in donor countries talking about, we need to reevaluate foreign aid. Maybe it's not actually doing what it was intended to do. Are there voices in borrowing countries, people that actually get the money that say, that money doesn't actually benefit us? Like I can think of maybe one example, but is that like a growing trend? People understanding that maybe development aid from, richer countries isn't actually benefiting them and they should kind of start to grow their own economies separately?
Yeah, you hear that in some. It's rare to hear that because the recipient governments always want to get money. Um, but you do hear independent voices saying that. I can think of a lot of scholars who are sometimes involved in politics in some developing countries that have been making that point, and also a lot of opposition politicians in many countries that tend toward authoritarianism do not appreciate it when their governments, the governments that rule them, receive foreign aid from the World Bank or the IMF or whatever, because they see it as strengthening a regime that they oppose. So you do see that, but that kind of opposition tends to be more situational.
Ian, I mean, you're being very generous
Thank you.
with your time. Let me ask one other quick thing. I think to me, one of the characteristics why foreign aid doesn't work is a headline of why stuff doesn't work when people give away other people's money. And I'm just wondering if you've seen cases where there's private charity, private initiatives, where private individuals are giving away money, making so-called charity, whatever you want to call it, private aid. Are there instances where this happens, where there have been successes that you know about?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, there's a lot of NGOs that do that kind of work and that do charitable work and that only accept private money, and they will tell you, um, with this money we can educate three more children or whatever, and then they will follow up and give you a report about what happened with the money that you sent. There is a website whose name I'm trying to think of right now that is exactly for this kind of thing. Because obviously, if we're sitting here in whether it's Israel or France or the United States, and we want to do something to help poor people, we probably don't have the expertise or the time to go around different poor countries and investigate how our money can best be used. So there is a group that um, does that work for you. They have a website with all sorts of charitable types of activities, schools, um, projects, or whatever that you can finance and you can give through them, and then they give that money to the community in the Andes in Peru or the one in Nigeria or Kenya or whatever to provide clothes or food or whatever, and they keep you updated, and it has gotten very good reviews, and they're solid. They're a solid group that actually oversees a lot of different kinds of charitable activities. But let's remember, These are charitable activities. It's not economic development promotion, and that has a very important role to play. And I think that that's very, very positive. But yes, there's plenty of examples of that.